Welcome back to the scarlet color portion of the House Targaryen banner. This is part 3, and in the first 2 parts, if you're just joining us, I was talking about going over some of the history of the Targaryens, and where we last left off was near the tail end reign of Maegor the Cruel. And where I left off with him was he had in his lifetime 5 brides who were known as the Black Brides. One of them was Queen Jane of House Westerling, who gave birth to an armless, legless stillborn with both male and female parts, and she did not survive the child for very long. And in part 2, I did mention that there was a leader of the Poor Fellows, one of the militant wings of the faith, was known as Wat the Hewer, and he survived the Battle of Bitterbridge, and Maegor the Cruel cut his arms and legs off and had him kept alive so he could watch him get married yet again. And I'm pretty sure that there's some connection, or George Martin, I believe, was trying to imply some kind of connection between Wat the Hewer and the armless, legless, stillborn child that he got with Queen Jane of House Westerling. There was only one bride that Maegor ever had that was faithful to him or his equal in the ways of cruelty, and that would be Tiana of the Tower, who was a raven-haired Toshi woman that many people said was a witch, and they were probably not far off. Whether or not she actually practiced black magic is never explicitly said. However, Tiana eventually confessed to poisoning his other brides to taint their seed, and Maegor cut out her heart with his sword Blackfire. Queen Eleanor of House Costain also had a stillbirth, and this one was an eyeless monstrosity with wings. And it was around this time, once the multiple brides of Maegor the Cruel were unable to produce him an heir, and many people, including mostly High Lords among Westeros, I think this is probably what turned them, is once those people had to start to worry, then his support just started to quickly evaporate. It was actually the stillbirths that convinced everyone that Maegor was an abomination. In 48 AC, and if you're not familiar with the year conventions, so that means 48 years after the conquest, and in terms of that, it's basically year 0, or kind of the moment that everything circles around, is the moment that Aegon the Conqueror was coronated in Old Town, not when he landed at the mouth of Blackwater Rush in what would be King's Landing. So in 48 AC, Septon Moon and Sir Joffrey Doggett, also known as the Red Dog of the Hills, who was the leader of the Poor Fellows, outlaws, turned against Maegor, and the Riverlands stood with them. Daemon Valerian, of House Velaryon, I should say. It's spelled very much like Valerian, but it's Velaryon. The admiral of the royal fleet turned against the king, and in turn many houses followed suit. Unifying this rebellion was Jaehaerys, the 14-year-old son of Aenys, that Lord Baratheon had thrown his support behind, and because of that, he was named Hand of the King. Something else that just occurred to me: Aenys, spelled Aenys, his mother was Rhaenys, who spells her name almost exactly the same, except she has the RH in front of it. So if you ever confuse whether King Aenys the first, if his mother was Visenya or Rhaenys, just remember that he was partially named after his mother, so it would be Aenys. That is the probably only something that the upper 1% of nerds of Game of Thrones would ever care about. But in case you were curious who King Aenys' mother, the first king after Aegon, who his mother was, that's how you remember. Anyway. Queen Rhaena, Prince Aegon, Aegon the Uncrowned, his widow, and now Maegor's wife, found out about the proclamation to name Jaehaerys the new king. When she found out about this, she stole Blackfire and rode off on her dragon Dreamfire. Two Kingsguard members at the same time turned against Maegor as well. And so, with that, he called his loyal lords to King's Landing, but only a few small lords showed up. These were most likely small lords that were within close proximity of King's Landing, and therefore the only ones he could count on at that point. But his days were numbered, and he could see the writing on the wall. He was left alone in his council chamber that night when he realized that everyone was turning against him. And the next morning, he was found dead upon the Iron Throne. His arms had been slashed open from wrist to elbow, and a barb of iron was jutting out the front of his neck like a sword was poking through it from behind. It was never determined if anyone killed him or if he did it himself. Some claim that the Iron Throne itself killed Maegor the Cruel. He ruled Westeros for 6 years and 66 days. And that, boys and girls, is what we call an Easter egg that is large enough for even a child with no arms and no limbs that could find it. He died without an heir, and his nephew Jaehaerys took over as king and would rule Westeros for the next 55 years. So that means the fourth king of Westeros is Jaehaerys the Conciliator, also known as, in his later years, the Old King. Now, having read Fire and Blood last year, about a year and a half ago when it came out, I realized if there was one story that would be a hard pass for HBO around who to base a series off of, that prize would have to go to the long and peaceful reign of Jaehaerys the Conciliator. Now, there were a few squabbles early on, some mostly contesting his right to the throne, but those were quickly put to rest. There are a few things to note about Jaehaerys' reign, but I do want to say that it is by far the most difficult portion of Fire and Blood to read, because it is at least 4 lengthy chapters that go into, all parts of his life and all parts of the different reign. Really, what Jaehaerys, the story, was doing was he was being fruitful, very, very fruitful, with his queen/sister, Alysanne, who was loved by everyone as much as he was, possibly more. But one of the most significant things about the reign of King Jaehaerys the Conciliator was that he ordered construction of the roads to knit the cities of the realm together, and he did this to increase trade. And the biggest one of these roads was obviously the King's Road, which actually took decades to complete because it went all the way from King's Landing through Winterfell and reached all the way to the Wall. Before Jaehaerys' time, the laws of the land were largely remained local customs and laws specific to different regions. So laws in the Iron Islands and the North and the Riverlands are all going to have, are all going to be their different the cultural laws specific to the culture. That's what I was trying to think of. But in Jaehaerys' time, Jaehaerys actually codified the laws of Westeros into one law. The other notable thing that happened, and this was, I could only find this description of this in Fire and Blood, but Princess Aerea, I'm probably butchering the name, but it's Aerea, Aerea, the oldest daughter of Aegon the Uncrowned and Princess Rhaena. Aegon the Uncrowned was the son of King Aenys I, who died on Dragonback against Maegor the Cruel and his dragon Balerion. But Princess Aerea rode Balerion and was missing for over a year. Now, the thing about Princess Aerea was that she was a very willful child. And when she lived in King's Landing, she adored the court, and all the things that went with it, the mummers, the balls, the high lords and ladies that frequented the Red Keep. And then she had to move to Dragonstone, where she was not allowed to interact with the small folk, and was largely confined to the castle and probably bored out of her mind, from what I could tell. But she got on Balerion's back, and Balerion disappeared. There was a large reward for any information that could lead to Balerion, but there was no reports of seeing him. So it was determined that he actually had left Westeros and had flown east. Now, I said earlier in a previous video that Balerion is actually the last living creature to have visited Valyria before the Doom, and after a year he returned to Dragonstone with Princess Aerea, stick thin and near death. As soon as Balerion landed in the courtyard in Dragonstone, Princess Aerea all but collapsed under the minuscule amount of strength that was holding her together. She had a fever that consisted of bloody eyes and smoke coming out of every hole in her body. Her parents, King Jaehaerys and Queen Alysanne, those were not her parents. Aegon the Uncrowned and Princess Rhaena were, but Jaehaerys and Alysanne were not allowed to see her per Septon Barth's orders. And in his diary, it was later recounted what exactly he saw, and by all accounts, he was disturbed beyond belief. The thing he describes is that her body, like I said, was it was like a fever, but the knight that was holding her could actually feel the heat through his armor. Her eyes were bloody, and there were things crawling around under her skin like they was trying to get out. And because she was so thin, it was obvious. They said it was clear. They could see that very clearly, and that it was causing her a tremendous amount of pain. She was plunged into an ice bath. The worm-like creatures, which were described with human hands and faces, crawled out and quickly died in the cold. Now, if this theory that Balerion had actually flown back to Valyria, where he's actually from, since he wasn't seen in Westeros that whole time, if that is the case, that would make Princess Aerea the only known person to have gone to Valyria and returned alive, albeit very briefly. There were several other travelers who had voyaged to Valyria to plunder it for wealth, but none of them ever returned. Septon Barth was King Jaehaerys' best friend, and also served as the hand of the king. until his death in 98 AC, a few short years before King Jaehaerys followed him. He was also the author of Unnatural History, which is a study on dragons and where they came from. It was actually his theory that shadowbinders and mages in the Shadowlands near Ashai by the Shadow had actually used blood magic on wyverns and created dragons. How well this theory holds up in the among the current Game of Thrones maesters is not known to me at this time. The book itself, Unnatural History, was actually a favorite book of Tyrion Lannister's, and it was also ordered burned by Baelor the Blessed, along with the Testimony of Mushroom, who will come up later in the Targaryen's history. Septon Barth is also regarded as one of the best hands to ever serve, and arguably to the greatest king. Another noteworthy event that was held during Jaehaerys' reign was the Great Council of 101 AC, and it was held at Harrenhal to determine the matter of succession. Since Jaehaerys was now old, and many of his heirs had died. In fact, him and Queen Alysanne had 13 children in their lifetime, and over 55 years. That produces a lot of Targaryens. But at the Great Council of 101, it was determined that the crown could only pass from male to male, and not male to female, or from male to male through the mother. So after all the other claims were laid aside, there were two main contenders to inherit the throne after Jaehaerys passed, and that was Laenor Velaryon, who at the time was 7, and Jaehaerys' grandson, Viserys Targaryen, who was 24, and Viserys was ultimately chosen. 3 years before that, in 98 AC, the Great Tourney was held in King's Landing to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Jaehaerys' reign, and it was the largest gathering of dragons since the Doom of Valyria. Now, an interesting little note of nerd trivia. There is an artistic depiction of the Great Tourney that was held in King's Landing. And you see the tourney grounds, you see massive amounts of people in the stands. There's a jousting match going on the grounds. And in the background is the Red Keep. And even further in the background is the Sept of Baelor. Now, this building was not completed for another 100 years. So that is what is known as an anachronistic error on the part of the artist. Although I'm sure there's a lot of things. There's a lot of artwork in that book that has some anachronistic errors, but I won't get into those here. That's just a little fun fact for all of you. It looks great. The Sept of Baelor looks great in the background next to the Red Keep. It didn't exist when the Great Tourney was held. Queen Alysanne went on progress and visited lords and ladies throughout the realm during Jaehaerys' reign, and she actually was the only Targaryen royalty who visited the Wall and was hosted by the Night's Watch. The castle of Snowgate was renamed Queen's Gate in her honor. That castle has since been abandoned. And I was a little surprised by this when Jaehaerys died at the age of 64. Every picture I've seen of him looks like he's closer to about 90, or kind of looks like Howard Hughes a little bit towards the end, or maybe I'm thinking of Montgomery Burns when he didn't leave his casino for several weeks. But anyway, he died at the age of 84, and the Targaryen house was at the height of its power and had the largest number of Targaryens living at any point in time during the reign of the dragons. And since it was 55 years, other stuff did happen. And if you want to read about it, the best resource to get really some nitty gritty details about the reign of King Jaehaerys, I would recommend. Um, I would highly recommend reading Fire and Blood, the 4 or 5 chapters that consist of Jaehaerys' reign. It is especially nice if you are reading it before bed and need something to get to sleep, because it's 55 years of the peaceful, a long and peaceful reign of King Jaehaerys. So once he passed from this, as they say, veil of tears, King Viserys, his grandson, took the throne, and King Viserys was actually the last rider of Balerion after Aegon, Maegor, and Princess Arya. By this point, Balerion was old and sluggish and spent most of his time sleeping. So this is basically when he was in his old, tired cat phase. And after Balerion died, Viserys never claimed another dragon after that. Viserys was also known as the Fat King, for he loved food, and he was also known as the Laughing King, as he enjoyed merriment. And his court included a dwarf fool named Mushroom, who would end up writing a historical memoir called The Testimony of Mushroom, which is a scandalous book filled with dubious claims that much of the dance of the dragons is detailed in, since he was significant for many of the events. People at court assumed that he was a half-wit, and so they weren't really careful about what they spoke about when they were around him. Hence, that's why a lot of the historical information we have about the Dance of the Dragons, specifically things that were said between Queen Rhaenyra and people close to her, was taken from him. Although there's a lot of stuff he does say that is very, very much not true. Historians tend to be very annoyed with this book, as a lot of it is true and a lot of it's dubious, like I said. King Viserys had a brother, Daemon Targaryen, who deeply coveted the crown and strongly desired to succeed his brother. He served on the small council until he was appointed commander of the city watch. He was on Viserys' small council, but due to his rivalry between him and the Hand Sir Otto Hightower, he was appointed the commander of the city watch. King Viserys had a daughter named Rhaenyra, who was also known as the Realm's Delight, who sat with him at court and basically tended to all of his meetings with the high lords and ladies and with the small folk as well. He did this because it was Viserys' intention, despite the edicts of the Great Council of 101, he had every intention that Rhaenyra would succeed him as his heir. Now, Queen Rhaenyra's mother, King Viserys' first wife, died. I believe it was at giving birth to a son. Yes, Balon, and she died, and the wife died a few days later. He did get a second wife, Alicent Hightower, who was the daughter of his hand, Sir Otto, and she bore him a son, Aegon. And people started to pester him to name Aegon heir, but Viserys refused, considering the matter closed. He had said Princess Rhaenyra was going to inherit his crown, and that was that. And Princess Rhaenyra and Queen Alicent did get along at first, but it soon became pretty hostile. There's actually pretty good artwork between the two of them at the tourney at 111 AC, and this was the anniversary to celebrate the 5-year anniversary of Viserys and Alicent's marriage. Now, at this tourney, Queen Alicent wore a green gown, but Rhaenyra showed up in scarlet and black. And at court, there was basically two different parties. One that was in support of Princess Rhaenyra taking the throne, and the other that was in support of Queen Alicent and her son's claim to the throne, Prince Aegon. And so the two parties became known as the Greens and the Blacks. Greens for Queen Alicent and her son Aegon, and the Blacks for Princess Rhaenyra. These would later be the two groups that were the two colors that would designate the two sides between the Dance of the Dragons. From this point on, the history of Westeros gets fairly bogged down with names and the relationships between them. Since there's two huge factions that will be going to war pretty shortly within the terms of the story, I'm not going to get into all of them. We are coming up on towards the end of the video here, and also because there are banners specifically to Aegon II and a banner for Rhaenyra, I figured I'd forego trying to explain much of the Dance of the Dragons until then. And let me put it this way, I've read pretty much every Game of Thrones book at this point, at least twice, and even I have a hard time wrapping my head around a lot of the comings and goings of the Dance of the Dragons. Viserys died at the age of 52 in 129 AC, so 18 years after the tourney where the Greens and the Blacks were established. So basically this animosity between them had been bubbling and percolating for some time. And when he died in 129 AC, he left the realm wealthy and at peace. But the seeds for the dance had been sown during his reign, and pretty much immediately after his death, Aegon was crowned before his body the ashes even had a chance to cool from his funeral pyre, and thus the Dance of the Dragon began. So basically, just to kind of quickly go over what the Dance of the Dragons is, if you're not. The Dance of the Dragons was a civil war for succession, for control of the crown between two half-siblings of King Viserys, and that was Queen Rhaenyra, his oldest daughter, whom he intended to inherit the throne, and his eldest son from his second wife, Prince Aegon. Personally, I don't know who has the stronger claim to the throne. History pretty much gives the crown to Aegon, since he was the one who was coronated and anointed with the 7 oils. And he also has the stronger claim due to the edicts of the Great Council of 101. However, King Viserys argued that he's the king and he could override laws such as the Great Council. And he determined that Princess Rhaenyra would be the queen after he died. So it depends on, I guess, it depends on whether you agree with the Great Council or whether you agree with King Viserys' decision, whether you feel the coronation of King Aegon II was legitimate or not. I've actually thought of this for a while. I don't know if there actually was like someone who's like, yes, this person was definitely the king. The one thing that Game of Thrones books have always had the Game of Thrones books have definitely always had a theme running through it was, masculinity and men in charge. And throughout the Game of Thrones books, we were seeing that women start to take over.
and it starts off as a very, very male-dominated society. All of the history of Westeros is largely told through male figures, and a lot of times it's the women who are just there to, facilitate birth. So I feel like that's a big part of the reason why King or Aegon II was, listed as the King Aegon II in the history books, and not having some sort of like split, contested reign during the Dance of the Dragons. So it looks like we are wrapping up this half-hour video. Thank you for joining me. Looks like we are going to finish up House Scarlet in the next video. Hope you enjoyed, and we'll continue this discussion of the history of House Targaryen in the next one.